Welcome to Narcissist Apocalypse, everyone. I am Brandon Chadwick, and today we are going to be discussing guilt and what your partner made you feel guilty for and how that kept you in the relationship. But before we get to that, if you want to be a guest on our Survivor Story episodes, go to our website at narcissistapocalypse.com, fill out our guest form, and press the submit button, or email us at narcissistapocalypse@pm.me. So today we are going to be discussing guilt. We discuss fear, obligation, guilt, and shame a lot on the show, but today we're just going to be a little bit more focused on guilt, the different types of guilt, and how that kept you in the relationship. And by the end of this episode, you'll understand why leaving is so much more complicated than it looks from the outside world to the person who says, why didn't they just leave? So, and we're going to look at specific categories of guilt that tend to emerge in these toxic relationships, abusive relationships, and how each one functions psychologically and how they can collectively create a system that keeps people, abuse victims, abuse survivors, in their place. So, part one, what guilt is actually doing in these abusive relationships. So before we get into any specific categories here, it's really worth understanding here what guilt is designed to do and what happens when it gets activated in these types of relationships. So guilt in healthy relationships, it functions as a signal. You've done something that violated your own values or caused harm to someone that you care about. So that prompts repair. So in this instance, it is useful. But in a toxic relationship or abusive relationship, guilt can get manipulated. It will get attached to things that aren't actually your responsibility. And over time, that misplaced guilt begins to do several things simultaneously. Shift your focus inwards, so it is away from evaluating the relationship, and it will now come toward evaluating yourself. It keeps you in a repair loop, always trying to fix things, manage things, or compensate for something. And it makes the cost of leaving feel a lot bigger because by the time the guilt has built enough layers around it, leaving doesn't feel like a decision. It feels like an act of harm. So that's the function that guilt is serving in these abusive relationship dynamics, coercive control dynamics, and it really accumulates over time. And now we're going to go through the guilt categories. Category one is guilt for their emotions. So this is often where these things start. At some point, you begin to feel responsible for how the abuser feels, their anger, their sadness, their distress. So it stops feeling separate from you and starts feeling like something you're in charge of. So if the abuser is upset, you search for what you did. If they're hurt, you feel compelled to try to fix this. And there's often an implicit or explicit message that your actions cause their emotional states. And once you accept that framing, your energy starts to shift away from the question of whether is this relationship healthy for you and toward the constant work of managing that abuser's internal world. And we hear that in our survivor stories very, very often. In category two is guilt for their behavior. And this one is closely related to the first one, but it just goes a step further. So it's not just how they feel, it's what they do. So if they yell, if they withdraw, if the abuser sometimes escalates, the underlying message here becomes you made this happen. Their behavior is framed as a reaction to you. So the psychological effect of this is pretty significant. So when their behavior becomes your fault, you stop holding them accountable for it. You stop asking whether the reaction was reasonable or proportionate, and instead you are focusing on what you could have done differently to prevent it. So that's a really big distinction here and takes number one to a new level. It goes a little bit further. In category three here, we have guilt tied to the abuser's past and trauma. So this is playing upon compassion for this guilt. So you start carrying their history, their wounds, their past relationships, the way they've been hurt before. Statements like, what I've been through, or you're just like everyone else who left me are very common here. We hear this in the show a lot. And they do something very specific, the abuser here. They reframe your normal needs for space, for boundaries, for accountability as repetitions of past harm against them. So the result here is that leaving no longer feels like ending a relationship. It feels like you're traumatizing someone who is already being very hurt. And that's a big weight to hold. It's a massive thing to hold right here. And that can keep you in the relationship much further, much longer. Category 4, we have guilt for their stability. And at a certain point, you may start to feel responsible not just for their emotional state, but for the functioning of the abuser's day-to-day life, their housing, their finances, their ability to manage. And the internal question shifts here from, is this relationship healthy, to what happens to them if I leave? So this kind of guilt right here has emotion to it, but it's also logistical. And it makes leaving feel not like it's something that's easy, because you taking action here might have consequences on the other person's ability to live, their survival. That's what this type of guilt right here is doing, so the guilt for their stability. In category 5 we have here is emotional debt. And you might begin to feel that you owe the abuser for what they've given, for what they've sacrificed, for the time and effort they've put in. Even when something feels wrong, there's this voice that says, after everything that they've done, how can I walk away? And we hear this a lot when the abuser comes in as a savior in many instances. So you feel like you owe that person. They might have rescued you from an abusive household that you grew up in, and things along those lines. Or maybe you were having trouble having your ends meet and those things. So they might have saved you from those things. And then they're going to use this language of emotional debt, kind of like ungratefulness, this reciprocity that they want, that might come into play. So this is creating an emotional ledger, one that's always being recalculated in their favor. The debt never quite gets paid off. And sometimes these debts are true and not true. It could be their perception of things, of what they have done. And that keeps you in a position of feeling like you haven't earned the right to leave them. And that can keep you in one of these relationships, these abusive relationships, coercive control relationships, longer as well. And category 6 is guilt for having needs. And this is the point where guilt stops being about them and starts being about you. So your needs for consistency, for clarity, for respect, for emotional safety, they get reframed as, now you are excessive. Now you are too much. Now you're being unreasonable. Now you're being difficult. And over time, you stop asking whether are my needs being met, and you start asking whether you should have them at all. And it's eroding your sense of what you're entitled to as a person in a relationship. All of your needs in a relationship, everything about you in this relationship, this type of guilt, kind of creating a power dynamic that you don't have anything, you don't need anything. Asking for it is wrong, and I should feel bad about that because this other person's needs are trumping yours in every single way. And very much related to the one we just mentioned, we have guilt for setting boundaries. And this is where saying no starts to feel like it's causing harm. Saying no protects your time, your energy, your well-being, and it's getting interpreted as a rejection, as harshness, as betrayal. So boundaries stop feeling like self-protection, and they start feeling like I've damaged the person that I'm in a relationship with. I've inflicted harm on this other person, the abuser. That's what they want. So when boundaries feel like harm, they really become difficult to hold. So instead of no, you start finding yourself over-explaining, justifying, negotiating, which means the boundary is no longer really a boundary at all. And the guilt for setting boundaries has really set in, and the abuser has done a really good job in this situation for you to feel this way. And it keeps you trapped for a long time. And then up next, we have guilt for conflict. So at some point, bringing up a concern any concern starts to feel like an act of aggression, that you're starting something, or that you're ruining a moment, or that you're making things worse. So instead of addressing what's happening, you're just letting things go, except it doesn't actually go away. It just starts accumulating in the relationship, and the relationship will just continue on the surface while the unaddressed issues will start building underneath. And something we mentioned earlier, which was clarity, and it's a little bit different than the clarity that was mentioned before, because this is about seeing things and then having guilt for seeing those things. And to explain that is, if you start to see patterns more clearly, you start to understand what's actually happening in this relationship, things really start to sharpen. They're coming more into focus. Like, this is kind of like a built-in excuse in a way. Guilt will start to challenge that. Oh, they're not that bad. Maybe I'm focusing too much on the negative. Who am I to judge? So the guilt starts functioning as a way to really destabilize your perception of things, make excuses for things, to make you doubt the very clarity that might be helping you actually make these accurate assessments of the situation to get you out of these relationships. This is what this guilt is doing right here. It's helping you question the clarity once you get it. So at that point, you start to feel bad about the things that you're seeing, because, the abuser's done a really good job to manipulate you into thinking this way. And then the last one we have here, number 10 on our list, is guilt for leaving. And wanting to leave feels like giving up for some people. Actually leaving feels like harm, like they're abandoning someone. And that makes you feel like the bad person in this story, even when leaving is the right decision, even when it's necessary for your safety or for your well-being. The guilt that follows can be just profound, huge. I hurt them. I ruined everything. I should have tried harder. These just aren't small little thoughts that are going through your head. These are big thoughts, and they hurt. And these things can be persistent for months, even years after the relationship ends, questioning these things. That's what this guilt right here is doing, and it's keeping you in the relationship longer. And it's not something that you did. You were manipulated into thinking that way and feeling that way. So the next part here, after we mentioned all of those, is how this guilt loop works. So the basic loop is you feel guilty, so you try harder, so you stay longer. And the longer you stay, the more material there is, the more history there is, the more investment there is, the more entanglement is, which gives guilt more to work with. So each category feeds into the others. Guilt for their emotions keeps you focused on managing them rather than evaluating the relationship. Guilt for conflict keeps you from raising issues that need to be addressed. Guilt for your needs keeps you small. Guilt for boundaries keeps you exposed. And guilt for leaving keeps you in place even when every other signal is telling you to go. So what this loop does at this really structural level here is redirect your cognitive and emotional resources. So instead of asking, is this relationship healthy for me? You're asking, what am I doing wrong? And instead of evaluating things, you're managing things. And instead of stepping back, you're trying harder. And this is how this guilt loop starts to work, and how it is deployed to maintain power and control. So the next thing on our list here is what guilt reshapes. And one of the most important things to understand about guilt in these dynamics is that it just doesn't affect your behavior, it's affecting your perception of things. It changes how you see the relationship. Staying starts to look like care, like commitment, like loyalty, like the responsible thing to do. And leaving starts to look like harm, like selfishness, like failure, like betrayal. It changes how you see yourself. Your needs look like the problem. Your limits look like character flaws. Your desire to leave looks like a failure. And it changes how you see the other person, their behavior, which might look clearly harmful from the outside. But things are now getting contextualized. Things are now getting explained. Things are now being defended. And because you've been carrying their history, their emotions, their stability, you've invested in this person, in what they are, who they were, where they might be going, potential, the trauma of everything. And guilt makes it very difficult to look clearly at behavior when you feel responsible for the person behind it. And this is why victims of abusers, people who are in these situations, describe a huge sense of confusion and a feeling of not being able to trust their own perception. And a lot of that has to do with the guilt that is accumulated over time and what it does to your ability to evaluate situations properly. And as I say a lot in the show, it's hard to see outside the forest when you're right in it. It's way easier for someone who's a bystander on the outside seeing these things. They're not emotionally attached to anything here. They're not logistically attached to anything here with the abuser. They have no connections. So it's way easier for an armchair person to say something. But when you're in it, it is very difficult to understand. And there's a lot of confusion going on, and it makes it very difficult to leave and to evaluate what's going on at all. So before we leave today, the big question that I think I want everyone to start thinking about more and more is to ask yourself a different question. So right now you might be asking, did I do something wrong? And to maybe start shifting here to, how did I come to feel responsible for this? Because what's going on is you're carrying something that was never yours to carry, and you need to start to recognize that, even if it takes time. This isn't going to be an overnight thing, but this is a little bit of a beginning for you to start to kind of see things a little bit more clearly. If you can start asking that question, switching those questions, asking that question, and really inspecting what those answers are. So that's like the biggest thing that I want you to take from this episode, just the switching of those questions, and then just to start thinking about it. And do it if it only feels safe. If it's not safe for you to do, then don't go into it. If it's too much to handle, leave it for another day. Just put it away. Hopefully just listening to this right now will get you thinking about things, but do it in your time and when you feel it is safe for you. And hopefully you enjoyed this episode. Hopefully this episode was informative for you. And if you want to be a guest on our Survivor Story episodes, go to our website at narcissistapocalypse.com. Click on the guest form button at the top of the page. Fill out our guest form, press the submit button. And we also have a newsletter at our website, which has a workbook from every single Survivor Story episode going forward. So if you want to join our newsletter, it has a lot of reflections in there as well, narcissistapocalypse.com. And we also have a support group at narcissistapocalypse.com with Zoom meetings every Wednesday night, Thursday afternoons, and Saturday nights. So you can go to our website and join there as well. And that is it for today's episode. And I hope you have a good night.